I'm Michelle LePage.
And I'm Katherine DeClerq. Welcome to The Lowdown, where we take a big issue and break it down into lovely, digestible bits. Basically, we are here to tell you what you want
And need
to know. So, Michelle, did you pay your tuition yet?
Why, yes, I did. And now I have basically no money.
Well, what if I were to tell you that tuition will be going up yet again?
You know, that doesn't really surprise me. Since 2010, tuition in Ontario has increased 19.4%. That's $1,200 in the last 4 years.
I know my bank account has certainly felt it. And that number is shocking, 19% since 2010. That's over 4 years. Let's just take a moment to digest that fact.
Okay, moment over. The good news, tuition is predicted to increase by only 13% over the next 3 to 4 years.
Oh, goody.
As you've probably heard by now, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives released a report on tuition fees last week. The report tried to figure out how much tuition first-year students will pay over the length of their degrees.
We spoke to David McDonald, a senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, to learn more about the report. He told us that the 13% increase is based on a little more than just tuition fees.
Now, what we're doing is we're not just calculating the average tuition fees, but we're also including compulsory fees, which are an additional piece of the puzzle. And oftentimes what happens is that when average tuition fees are capped so that their increase is tied to inflation, you'll actually see compulsory fees, which are often not capped, increase much more substantially.
Now, when we talk about compulsory fees, this also includes athletic and student association fees. It basically encompasses everything a student pays in a year.
According to the report, that brings the Canadian average to about $7,000 by 2017-2018. Ontario tuition, though, is significantly higher than that average. That means our tuition could be over $9,000.
Tuition in Ontario is currently capped at a 3% increase a year. So, assuming that the Liberal government stays in power and there are no tuition freezes in our future, and that compulsory fees are not jacked up to balance that cap, that means that in 10 years or even 20 years, the cost of an undergraduate degree will be absolutely staggering. How are students going to be able to afford schooling, rent, groceries, and then expect to move out on their own at the end of those 4 years? Again, assuming that no one wants to do any sort of graduate degree.
And that's the issue. We feel like we have to go to school and get a degree in order to get a good job. But in order to pay for school, we need to get a job. Then when we finally have our degrees, the jobs aren't there and we either go back to school or take whatever low-paying job we can get. Basically, it's a vicious cycle of
But what does all of this talk of tuition increases really mean for students? Ryerson Students' Union VP Education Jesse Root joins us. Jesse, should we be panicking?
I think it's absolutely reasonable to be panicking. We've seen debt levels spike for students over the past 9 years of increases in tuition fees. We've seen food bank usage at the Ryerson Students' Union and elsewhere in the community go up. I mean, the reality of this situation is that high tuition fees don't just matter on campus, they matter in our lives and the way that we're able to participate in society and contribute.
So why should students care about this report?
They should care because it really puts into kind of a concise argument what we've been trying to say as students' union representatives for a long time. And that is that tuition fee hikes are happening, and they're happening because of two things. They're happening because university administration's priorities aren't the same priorities as students, and they're happening because of chronic underfunding at the provincial government level. And I think that's really well documented in the report. And again, going back to my original point, that these decisions by people who don't necessarily understand what it's like to be a low-income student have real effects on our lives.
So we talked a bit about kind of the repercussions now with these increased tuition fees. How is this going to affect students down the line after they graduate?
Well, what we already know is that students have a decreased capacity to participate in the economy in terms of buying houses, buying cars. We also know that the job market isn't all that friendly to students who graduate because of things like unpaid interns taking entry-level positions. which would ideally be filled by people who've been through a program to train them to do this work. So, I mean, at the end of the day, there are consequences in terms of economic participation as well as labor market.
And do we know if the Ryerson administration has kind of addressed this report, has said anything about what they're going to do?
Yeah, I saw an article the other day about it, and they talk about the part of it about provincial government underfunding, which is something we know and something we're also critical of. But on the other end of the stick, you see the province pointing their fingers at the institutions saying that we're giving you this money and you're not spending it in a way that's responsible to make sure that students have access to education. So it's one of these jurisdictional battles where we see one actor, the Ryerson in this case, or educational institutions generally pointing the finger at the provincial government, and we see the provincial government pointing their finger at Ryerson, and everyone's kind of like, we're doing our job and we're doing it well. Our position is that really these are both problems of the same variety. They're very related, and it's going to take systemic reform, which both parties and students have buy-in to really get a solution that is not based on this finger-pointing, but real solutions for students.
And what about the Ryerson Student Union? Are they planning on doing anything or addressing the issue?
I mean, we've been working on this issue for a number of years. We really see it as an issue of access to education and who has access and who doesn't. And one of the main things we're doing this year, starting off this weekend with our activist assembly, is giving people the tools to understand what systems of free education look like. They exist in the world, and that is really used to agitate them into doing some kind of action on campus.
And our last question for you, is a university degree worth it?
Our view of knowledge is that, and research generally, is that there's some kind of value in having creativity-based research, because that is fulfilling to us. It helps us answer questions that ultimately make life better for people. With the privatization of the university in terms of corporate involvement, but also downloading costs through tuition fees onto users or students, we see a lot less of that creativity-based research happening, and that's really the alarming thing, is that we are not learning to learn anymore and to find new solutions. We're learning because it gets us a job or it fulfills a need of a labor market need. So, I mean, I believe that university degrees are in and of themselves valuable because it's about a pursuit of knowledge. It's about an honest desire to make the world a better place through learning. But what becomes problematic is when all of these pressures, like tuition fees, like taking unpaid internships, moves us away from that creativity place, that the university degree, I think, loses its value.
All right, something to ponder until next time. Jesse, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's the end of this podcast. Catch us next week when we take another important issue and tell you basically why you should care.
I'm Michelle LePage.
And I'm Katherine DeClerq, and you've been listening to The Lowdown.